asked to remind everyone that there is going to be a quick budget discussion right after the dismissal prayer. For those of you interested in our goings-on, the elders have been exceptionally transparent, and that is a refreshing way in which church leaders can lead a congregation and allow everybody to know what's going on and where we are. It's hard to lead when you don't know where the leaders are going and can't even find the leaders sometimes. So it's been an honor and privilege, and I really appreciate the elders here. I appreciate the church here, especially concerning my lungs. They're not doing really great. Heat doesn't do well for my lungs. I can't breathe quite as well. Although, when they hired me, one of the elders had seen a video with me, and I had an oxygen tube stuck up my nose, and they still hired me. And I think it was because I did a really 7-minute sermon, and they were going, yeah. And then I get here and do a couple of 20-minuters, and it's like, okay, well, maybe we'll give him a try. And that's why I'm still on 1 and 2 week, hiatus, because I preached me a 35, 40-minute sermon. It may be a moving sermon. I don't know. So I've got to watch myself. But I really do appreciate working with this congregation. I appreciate the opportunities I believe we have here. And I really, honestly, and it's not just saying it, but I really believe we have great potential here. We really do. Channeling it, figuring out how we can best serve, that's going to be something we need to work on. But I really think we've got great potential. Going back to, from our text that we're going to look at in Judges, going back to Deuteronomy 12, it's just almost as though God knew what was going to happen with his people once he kind of turned them loose here. But in Deuteronomy, after Moses, before Moses had passed, in Deuteronomy, the 12th chapter, and the first verse, he begins through Moses the direction to follow what God says. Okay? These are the statutes and judgments which you shall be careful to observe in the land which the Lord God of your fathers is giving you to possess all the days that you live on earth. In other words, you're going into a property here that I'm giving you. It's a blessing to you, and here's what you do. You follow my commandments. In fact, as though it was almost prophetic in nature, in verse 8, you shall not do at all as we're doing here today, every man doing what is what is right according to his own eyes. That kind of tells you he knew what was coming. And so we get to the text in chapter 21, the end of Judges. And to me, if you study Judges, especially as a whole, and you look at the whole book of Judges, we understand it to be very cyclical. God's people would trust him, they would be blessed, and then for some reason, they began to take for granted. I don't know, maybe just forget because they didn't study enough or didn't remind themselves as to why they are blessed. And off the edge they went until they found themselves in a hard way, and then they realized, oh wait, if we'll go back to God, he'll bless us, and that's what they did. And sure enough, God was there to bless them. Of the many lessons that Judges does teach us, one of the ones that is so stark and vivid to any reader of Judges is that God, when you go back to God, he will be there. It's the same story in the New Testament when Jesus tells us the story of the forgiving father. Most of you in the heading of your Bible have prodigal son. I would prefer to look at it as the forgiving father, because really that's what it's about. And even when the older son was struggling with the fact that this younger upstart would come in after soiling and ruining the name and the inheritance that he had received, the older son is reprimanded a little bit as to how he's receiving back the younger son. It's a forgiving father that we are viewing here in Judges. This is not just a history of how sorry the Israelites were. It is an example of how God is forgiving. But there's another lesson that I think that crops up as you go through the Judges. Each chapter after each chapter, when they go down and then they come back up. And they go down, they come back up again. What do you see? And what I'm seeing in chapter 21 is the progression of the consequences of sin. And I just want to talk real briefly here to let you know that God is so incredibly forgiving. If you will repent, he will let you slide. He will bring you back in. But don't think for a minute that when you sin, there are consequences that will still be there. As a matter of fact, I am intent on believing that when it talks about in Galatians 6:1, those who fall or are overtaken in a fall, those of you who are spiritual, restore such a one. Well, what is that restoration like? Well, the restoration has everything to do with bringing somebody back from where they are, but it also has to do with helping them deal with the consequences of the sin that are still there. I tell the story, and I've told it many times, I don't wear a wedding band. There's a reason for that. Not that I don't love my wife dearly after nearly 48 or a little over 48 years, but I have a scar on here because I didn't listen to my father when he told me how to operate a knife. And I thought I knew more than my father, which, as it turns out, was not true. And when I didn't do what my father said, I ended up cutting my hand really bad, and I've got a scar here that rubs on any piece of jewelry I put on that finger. And so, yeah, my father forgave me, and I know God forgave me for not paying attention to my earthly father, but I guarantee you this, I can't put a piece of jewelry on that finger without it rubbing and itching and pretty soon hurting and rubbing raw down beneath the skin on those little scar bubbles that are on that finger. Your consequences of your sin hang with you. And what you see in chapter 21 is the consummation, the consequences gone to seed of a people who keep forgetting about God and going south, just forgetting it and going off the deep edge. You know, I think humanity runs in cycles, personally. I think our country runs in cycles. We come off a pretty tough bunch of years here not too long ago. We seem to be headed the right direction, but don't kid yourself. The vigilance is still essential. There needs to be a diligence in our people in this country to maintain the freedoms that we have, because we should not take them for granted. We've lived longer in this country with the freedoms we have than most nations live. And so we don't want to take them for granted. It's the same way with Christianity. Frankly, every day is a challenge, and every day is something we need to focus on so that we don't slip away. I was talking with somebody just a moment ago before or after the morning service. A man mentioned J.D. Tant's comment that was very popularized throughout the Brotherhood. It was a kind of a sounding of a warning, like Ezekiel, a watchman. Brethren, we are drifting. Some of you older folks have heard that one before. Brethren, we are drifting. The idea of getting away from God is not some shocking boom and it just happens and we're away from God, way off in the boonies. No, it happens in little small increments. One of the challenges for leadership, elders, one of the challenges is to identify these little slips that happen in order to kind of steer things back to the right path. It's a challenge, and evidently in Judges that was not happening very regularly, because every time the judge came in and helped them out, it wasn't long before off the deep edge they fell again. And then what you see is the culmination of it, because in this particular context right here, you're looking at a terrible circumstance where they're basically, as some have accused some churches of Christ, they're eating their own. They get to a point where they are so caught up in themselves that they end up damaging and hurting those about them that they shouldn't even be involved with. They murdered people from Jabesh Gilead that because they just didn't happen to show up at the same place that everyone else did in the tribes when they were having problems with Benjamin. Benjamin did a horrible thing, and you'll have to read the history of it in 20 and 19 prior to this, but they did something horrible, and the children of Israel got together and they voted on it, and they said, okay, we're going to wipe out Benjamin because they did this. And after 2 or 3 tries, they managed to pretty much put an end to all of the tribes of Benjamin, all of its tribe. And then they realized, oh, wait a minute, we should be careful here because this is one of the 12 tribes, and they need to perpetuate. And there wasn't even enough lives for them to perpetuate, to continue on. Now, I'm not sure that was really the case. That was the argument for things that they did. Because if you look at Abraham, here's one man and one woman and one child of promise, Isaac. And God told Abraham, your offspring will be like the sand of the sea. I'm not sure Benjamin had plenty. It's just that one of the panic modes that they were in at the time was, oh no, we've got to find wives for Benjamin. And after wiping out most of Jabesh Gilead, they ended up trying to get wives out of there. They found 400 young virgins in verse 12 that had not known a man, and so that's the ones we're going to get. But look at the way way in which they went about even getting the wives. It wasn't as though they were going over there and allowing Jabesh Gilead to make the decision to give the wives. No, we're going to go steal them. It's kind of like a Sadie Hawkins day in the reverse, if you know what I'm talking about. Kind of a strange situation where you just go in where these virgins are out partying because it was the holiday in that year, and as they were doing that, in come these raiders, and the Benjamites came in and just took whomever, carried them out, I guess, over their shoulders, whatever the case may be. That was not a right solution for the issues that they had. Nevertheless, that's what they did. And then in verse 22, then it shall be when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us. Well, that was one of the things that led up to this circumstance. The individuals here in Israel had said, we're not going to give our wives to any Benjamite because of what they've done. Well, that was a foolish vow. And that was one of those deals where they should have consulted with God before they made these kind of vows, but now they've made them, and so they're going to keep tabs on them. And Jabesh Gilead didn't have to be there, so they didn't make the vow. And so I guess they're free game. We'll just go over and steal their virgins. What you see is the consummation of sin as it gathers steam, rolls downhill, continues to get worse and worse, to the consequences that men act in such a way that is totally unauthorized by God. There's so many things wrong in this account as to what children of Israel did. Why in the world did this happen? And when you get down to the bottom, you see the conclusion of it all. This is why things happen like this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I think it's an interesting thing when you get the progression past the judges and you get into the kings, okay, of how this works, because most of the people around them at that time had kings. In fact, we know that was the case, and was so popular a governmental scenario that that's what the children of Israel wanted when Samuel became one of the last, or was the last judge, and was a priest, and was a caretaker and a prophet, and so forth. He wasn't actually a priest, but he was a caretaker and a prophet. And so therefore, when Samuel fell out of favor because his kids were rotten, the people wanted a king. And why is that? Well, the kings of that era were the disseminators of justice. They were the ones that kept things right, or at least should have. And so their concept was, we need a king. Instead of going back to God and doing the things that Moses said in Deuteronomy 12, you ought to be doing. Listen to my commandments. And an interesting thing that occurs when they do get the kings later on is that God tells them through Samuel, if you and your king do what I tell you, things will go good for you. But if he doesn't or you don't, y'all will die, and you'll die together because you're not doing what I tell you to do. The cycles of sin have consequences that tend to build up and accelerate, and sometimes it would seem that they are overwhelming and we can't get over them. Now, such is not the case. We can get over whatever's happened in our life, but the only way we can do that is to go back to God for the solutions. The problem with these people is that their fix for this problem, this accelerated, exaggerated issue of consequences in the end of Judges, was, let's get us a king. That is not a solution. Human leadership in matters of spirituality always falls short. Always falls short. Whether it's king or priest or whatever you want to call it, it always falls short. The only real answer is you go back to God for your solutions. God not only fixes where you are at the moment, but he fixes the problems of your past in a way in such you can deal with them while you're trying to progress and get better as the child of God you ought to be. Judges is a sad book in my viewpoint. In one way, it does give us hope because God is always there to forgive us when we come back to him. But what we must realize is when you continue in sin, the consequences will continue to accelerate. They don't get less. And God will forgive you. I'm a firm believer that had Judas fell upon his knees and said, Lord, forgive me, he would have been forgiven. I just don't know that Jesus would have given him back the bag. You know what I mean? Now, certainly it is the case that when Peter went out and wept bitterly, he was the chief spokesman that opened the doors of the all of us. God can fix whatever's wrong in your life, but He'll not do it unless you rely totally and completely on Him. And any other fix is not going to help what goes wrong in our lives. Judges, the people in the Judges should have realized that. Children should have understood that. A lot of the horror that you read, and boy, it gets worse and worse. I won't get into it, but the concubine in chapter 19 is just an ugly story. Didn't get into the graphics of it, but I'll tell you, that was nasty. It was horrible. And it's recorded there in graphic detail as to how it went down. How does a people get to that point? Well, you leave God. Our country has done that in some regard. I've seen the Lord's body do the same thing. And it's amazing the ugly things that happen when we get away from God. The solution is not going to be found in men. It's not going to be found in policy or church dogma. It's found in obedience to God. Had these people realized that, the kings would not bend their resolution to the problem. They would have gone back like it was at the beginning of Judges, the end of Joshua, where Joshua would tell them, choose you this day whom you will serve. Because that's what it comes down to. Who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve God? Or are you going to serve whomever or whatever else? Because that's not going to fix it. Judges is a great testament of how not to follow God. We should be following God in a right way and doing what He said. If you're not doing that tonight, you need to be. Change your life. Change it now while you have opportunity. And we invite you in the song we sing. Won't you stand?